BionicDance is filmed in front of a live studio audience.
As crazy as our culture is when it comes to sex, it still sees consent as a necessary condition for appropriate sexual behavior. And this is a good that we must rejoice in.
Well, yeah, sex without consent sounds kinda rapey. Let's do this.
BionicDance's YouTube channel?
Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. Carlo Broussard is a Catholic apologist who's going to explain to us why consent isn't enough to justify having sex. At least, not according to his worldview anyway. Personally, I think you should take it when you can get it, as long as everyone involved wants it. Thing is, wanting it is where consent comes from. The two are integral. You can't separate them. True, sometimes someone will say yes out of fear, but consent given under duress is not really consent at all.
But is consent the only moral criterion for evaluating sexual behavior? Here are some reasons why it's not. First, we don't buy this ethical principle when it comes to other behaviors. Take self-injury, for example. We don't think a so-called trans-abled person is morally justified in having a doctor render her paraplegic just because she consents to it.
While I admit that does sound kinda screwy, it actually is kinda screwy. It's a rare mental syndrome called body integrity identity disorder that makes a person think they ought to be disabled. Thing is, you know what I can't find? A doctor willing to make her dream come true. Consent has to go both ways.
That someone says yes to cannibalism doesn't make cannibalism morally permissible, as in the case involving Orman Maivas, who butchered and ate a willing victim who responded to his internet ad.
Okay, so consent went both ways in that case, but this is hardly a fair comparison. You see, this could be legitimately described as harm, where sex is usually quite fun, and with appropriate precautions taken, completely harmless.
We're repulsed at such behaviors because we recognize that they're bad and thus should be avoided. But notice that consent is not driving that moral evaluation.
True, it's not. Consent is a gateway. It's giving or withholding permission. It's veto power. By the time consent is a factor, a lot of hoops have already been jumped through, and not necessarily as negotiation between the interested parties. By the time they get to asking each other for consent, they've already decided that what they want to do is totally cool. It's only, as he said, when we look at it that a moral judgment against it is made, and consent isn't in our court unless it's happening to us. We might try to prevent what we see as harm, but we aren't the ones buying the tickets to go on that ride.
What's in the driver's seat is a more fundamental underlying moral theory that says these actions are bad and that we ought not do them.
Yeah, it's called empathy. It's you knowing that you wouldn't want whatever it is happening to you, knowing that other people probably wouldn't want it happening to them. And it's looking at other people doing those harmful things and questioning whether they've really thought that shit through. Morality comes from comparing ouch that hurts to hey that's nice. Nothing else is required.
For consent to have any moral legitimizing power, it requires a pre-existing moral standard that determines which behaviors we're morally allowed to consent to. You might think of our consent's moral power as being on loan. Its currency is derived from a deeper moral standard. Of course, what that moral standard is would need to be worked out. I claim it's the natural moral law.
And now we start getting into woo, because natural law isn't natural at all. It's supernatural. Seriously, look it up. This dude is a Catholic apologist, so obviously that's where he's going to go with this. And just as obviously, he's not going to make any effort to prove its legitimacy.
But we must admit that there must be a moral framework that gives consent the power to make something morally permissible. So, if consent has moral significance only on account of a more fundamental moral framework, then it's futile to appeal to consent alone in establishing the moral permissibility of sexual acts.
The assumption being that this moral framework is universal and not personal. As far as I've been able to tell, each individual has their own personalized set of morals in their head, and thankfully there's a lot of overlap due to natural selection and education. Have you ever noticed the obnoxious and self-centered behavior we see in children, and probably did the same stuff when we were kids? Morals don't exactly come naturally to everybody. Look at all the other cultures out there with moral values that we find horrible, and they find ours just as wretched. Tell me again how there's a universal moral framework.
It's seeking moral power where no moral power can be found.
Permissibility of sexual acts is moral power. Giving or withholding consent is moral power. What he's looking for is a reason to say that you shouldn't get a little something something because of some rules he thinks you ought to be following. His rules. His God's rules. That's not moral power. That's surrendering moral power to someone else. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please, think.
Even YouTubers need Ferraris. Please donate on Patreon.
Reading videos has been found to cause fresher breath, enhanced metabolism, and greater sexual magnetism.